I chose to do my weekly presentation on Chapter 7, which covers race, ethnicity, and social inequity within policing. This chapter goes into great details of the systemic issues that contribute to unequal treatment of different racial and ethnic groups by law enforcement and explores how historical contexts have shaped current policing practices and the impact those practices have on minority communities. The chapter starts off by outlining the historical roots of racial inequities within policing, like how the origination of policing started back in the 1816 and 1700s when patrols occurred within slave grounds to ensure that Native Americans and African Americans stayed within the slave quarters. And then it goes into how fear tactics during segregation were implemented by the police officers to ensure that African Americans did not boycott or riot during the civil rights movements. While the constitutional amendments were put in place to protect all Americans, there are several case laws like the Terry versus Ohio case where the Supreme Court decided that Terry frisk were okay, which basically provided police officers the free will to profile and target minorities based off of the assumption that any reasonable doubt that they assumed that the individual was deserving of a search and seizure, which basically turned into profiling and the target of minorities based on an officer's own suspicions and bias. After providing the historical background, Chapter 7 starts explaining the statistical evidence behind the racial inequities within the police departments, not only with police encounters on minorities versus white Americans, but the effect that the negative encounters have on the minority communities. And also the statistics surrounding the internal biases that occurs in regards to hiring and promoting practices within departments. As a Black woman, I know the effects of racial inequities within the police department, as statistics show that African Americans are more likely to be gunned down by law enforcement than white Americans, even though white Americans take up most of the population and have more encounters with the police. Last year, I personally had to overcome the emotional distress that is associated with losing a loved ones in the hands of a police officer, which was a lot to deal with, knowing that my loved one was not armed and had a mental disability. So, going back to the chapter, towards the end of Chapter 7, it breaks down the social and psychological impacts of these disparities, such as how it creates mistrust with law enforcement in the minority communities, and how the criminal justice system within the minority communities impacts their perception of police. The chapter concludes by breaking down various solutions to improve inequities within the police force. That can include hiring and recruiting more minority officers so that there's more of a minority presence within minority communities. And it also can include better training that includes bias and prejudicial training. And also measures that could be implemented within the police department is analyzing data that shows if their practices are, how their practices are impacting minority communities, and making sure that there are accountability measures put in place.